Hey guys, my name is Sara Martin. I live here in Haywood County, North Carolina. My husband and I have a farm and business called Sustainabilities. We have a high mountain farm where we grow organic produce, and we also teach about sustainable living, homesteading, and food preservation. I'm here today to talk to you guys about composting because composting is so incredibly important to our farm. The piece of property that we bought was an ecological disaster. It had not been loved for an incredibly long period of time, and most of our soils had kind of washed away with all the rain that we get here in western North Carolina. And so when we tried to grow a garden, the soils were very heavy in clay, there weren't a lot of nutrients, and so we had to use composting to help rebuild healthy soils and to help to encourage healthy growth for our plants. A lot of people don't realize that healthy soils are literally the key to having a good, productive garden. And so composting allows for you to do that. And so I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the reasons why we compost, how to compost, and just some basic information so you guys can get out there and start composting yourselves, because it's actually really, really easy to do and it's really rewarding. So some of the reasons that we compost, I've already touched on. It helps to enrich our soils. When we look at soil is actually made of two main components. We've got the inorganic materials, the sand, the silt, the clay, and these are small particles of rock that have been broken down through the process of weathering and help to build the physical structure of our soil. The other component of our soils are the organic materials. And I'm not talking about organic like organic crops and food. I'm talking about organic from the chemistry sense of the term organic. When a chemist talks about organic, they're talking about molecules and compounds that have been made by living organisms or once were part of a living organism. And so don't ever ask for an organic chemist to give you a plate of organic salad, because he might pour crude oil right over that thing. And so when we talk about these organic materials in our soils, we're looking at broken down plant and animal material as well as waste materials from those living organisms. And that organic material in the soil is the magic component, because all of those inorganic materials, the sand, the silt, and clay, are great for structure, but they provide almost no nutrients and no food to the soil biome. And so all of the nutrients, all of the food for your plants, and all of the living organisms in that soil all comes from that organic material. And so when we compost, we're adding additional organic material to our soils, and we're providing food and nutrients for all of the living things that are using that soil. Another really great reason to compost is because it allows us to reduce the pressure on landfills. We send a lot of organic material to landfill. We send way too much stuff to landfill in general. We should be recycling. We should be really working hard to reduce that pressure on landfills, because number one, it saves us money by not having to build new landfills. It also helps to protect natural wild places, because as we have to create new landfills, what are we doing? We're going out into pristine habitat and we're filling it full of garbage. We don't want to have to do that. But also another important part of not sending all of these compostable materials to the landfill is that as these things break down in landfill, they can't break down completely. And it produces a large amount of methane gas. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And so one of the main reasons why landfilling is so negative to our environment is the huge carbon footprint that it has. And so by reducing the amount of organic material we're sending to landfill, we're reducing that methane that our landfills are producing. Another thing that's really great about composting is that we're conserving water. When we add that organic material to our soil, that's where the water holding capacity comes from. All those little crevices and cracks and those squishy, soft, once living materials, that's what holds that water in the soil. So it's going to reduce the time that you're spending watering your gardens and your lawn, as well as the fact that it is reducing the amount of water that you're using, which saves you money. It saves water, and if we think about the fact that all of that processed water that comes from our municipalities has been processed, and so energy has been used to process that, and so we actually are reducing our carbon footprint even further, and so that's great. Another thing that we're doing is we're reducing our dependence upon inorganic fertilizers. When you buy a fertilizer from the store that says 10, 10, 10, it's telling you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is in that. And those compounds, unless you're buying an organic fertilizer, are coming from chemical processes which require energy and produce materials that are more difficult for our environment to absorb. And so while fertilizing your plants is a great thing to do, when we use these chemical fertilizers, a lot of that actually ends up in our waterways, contributing to pollution of our waterways, as well as it's taxing environmental resources. Our phosphorus reserves are actually really starting to get low, and there are a lot of environmentalists that are concerned about where are we going to get phosphorus from in the future. But when we add that organic compost to our soil, that helps to not only add nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus to our soils, because that's all in those molecules that make up our living bodies, but also it adds the ability for our soils to hang on to those nutrients. So even if you are deciding to not go organic and use the chemical fertilizers, if you're using them responsibly, less of that's going to end up in water and contribute to pollution. And so composting is an awesome thing to do. There are all these fabulous reasons that we should be composting. And so we ask about, why do we want to add compost to our soils? How is that actually going to improve them? And like I said, it's going to add nutrients directly. It's going to increase the water holding capacity, and it feeds that biome, that actual ecosystem that's in our soil. A lot of people think of soil as dirt, but it's not. Soil is a living ecosystem. There are more living organisms in a teaspoon of soil that are microscopic organisms, and there are macroscopic big organisms living in the entire county of Haywood County. It's crazy to think about it, but the soil is jam-packed full of living bacteria, fungi, tiny little invertebrates, worms and insects, all kinds of neat things that are working together to create this fully functional ecosystem that is just right here beneath our feet, that you would never even know exists unless you pulled out a microscope and took a look. And so we actually feed all of these guys with the things that we put into our soil. And so by adding compost, we're actually increasing the food and nutrient sources for all these organisms and producing a healthy and vibrant ecosystem that's much more resilient than an ecosystem that is just propped up by the use of chemical fertilizers. And so you're going to actually have healthier plants, which is going to reduce your need for adding fertilizers. It's also going to reduce your need for the use of fungicides and other chemicals that might help to combat disease, because if your plants are healthier, because your soil's healthier, they're going to be more resistant to any kind of pathogen that might try to attack them. And so what exactly is composting? I actually just recently had somebody said, I think I actually have a compost pile. I didn't even know it. Composting actually isn't as tough as a lot of people think. It's really simple. Yeah, you can get super nerdy with composting and have a really amazing compost pile that generates fresh, complete compost in 2 to 3 weeks. But you can also just have a pile in the back part of your property where you're throwing stuff and you just allow for Mother Nature to take care of it. Composting is just taking organic materials, plants, and animal waste, and creating an environment that is beneficial to the microbes that want to break that material down. When we look at microbes breaking that down, we've got two different kinds of organisms that are decomposers. We've got macroorganisms, which are the big guys that we see a lot. The millipedes, the worms, all the insects that are going to get on this and they're going to chew it up into tiny little pieces. They're going to take this leaf and they're going to chew it into just little fragments, little bitty pieces. And then these little bitty pieces will be worked upon by micro decomposers, fungi and bacteria that are in the soil that actually break these complex materials down into the basic building blocks of our cells. And so once those things become basic building blocks, plants can take those things up through their roots and utilize those just like little bricks to build the cell. And so that's why it's so critically important to have all those complex nutrients in there, because anything is just going to take those nutrients from its environment and use it to build its body. So when we look at the soil and we look at composting, we're just mimicking a natural process. If you go into the woods, leaves fall down, twigs fall out of trees when the wind blows, and these all contribute to that soft, fluffy layer on the forest floor that we like to refer to as duff or detritus. Detritus is a great word. And that detritus actually is broken down by those macro decomposers into little nutrients that are washed by the water into the soil, and then it's broken down by fungi and bacteria. That allows for the forest to flourish. Unfortunately, when we look at our yards and gardens, we don't really allow that to happen. We remove all that spent old material. You know, these squash leaves right here, I am not going to leave these squash leaves in place because I've got Mexican bean beetles, I've got squash bugs, I've got all kinds of critters that are attacking my plants. And if I leave all this material here, I'm just going to leave a place for those guys to overwinter. And then next spring when I go to plant my garden, I've got all these wee beasties that are coming out of all this organic material that are going to attack my crops. So I don't want to do that. But what I can do is remove all this material, take it to a place where I can create a really hot compost pile that's going to kill all those little buggers. And so it allows us to emulate the natural processes that are happening out there in the forest on our property, but still remove all that material from our garden so we're not contributing to disease or just unsightliness. You know, if you think about it, a garden where you've got a whole bunch of dead stuff is not going to be the most beautiful thing to a lot of people. And a lot of us live in neighborhoods where we have to worry about what our yards look like. So we won't have big piles of dead stuff all over the place. But we can collect that all and create a really amazing compost pile, and then take that compost to add back to our gardens after it's been allowed to be cleaned by the natural process of composting. So when we look at a compost pile has got 3 stages of breakdown. It has to do with temperature. There are some cool temperature bacteria that like to break stuff down at really cool temperatures. They'll break stuff down all the way to 28 degrees. So even in the wintertime, even though it's a slow process, your compost pile's still working really hard. And those little guys will push the temperature up. Just like if you go into a room with a bunch of people hanging out, visiting, or maybe even dancing and moving their bodies, we generate heat. And so do all these microorganisms as they break down their food. And so that heat's gonna push the temperature of your compost pile up. As it starts to get warmer and warmer, the mesophilic bacteria, or the medium guys, are gonna start taking over. And most of the action in your compost pile is gonna happen right around in there, between 60 and 70 degrees. These guys are just gonna go bonkers, and they're just gonna start eating like crazy. And they're really gonna break that organic material down. But they're gonna make heat too. And eventually they'll actually make it so hot that they're just gonna kind of take a nap, and the thermophilic bacteria take over. Thermo, I know we all know that means heat, right? We're used to thermoses and thermometers. And so the thermophilic bacteria are the little guys who really crank it into overdrive. They can take your compost pile to temperatures between 140 and 160 degrees. A good rockin' compost pile, when you dig into it, will steam. And you know those thermophilic bacteria are in there doing their thing. And the beautiful thing about that high temperature caused by those thermophilic bacteria is it kills pathogens, it kills weed seeds, and it kills all that nasty stuff that we don't want to put back into our gardens. And so you can throw all this material into your compost pile, and you don't have to worry about infecting your gardens with disease or basically planting a bunch of weed seeds if you can get that compost pile nice and hot. But the real key for thermophilic bacteria is oxygen. Just like us, I can't do much dancing and hanging out if I can't breathe, right? I'm not gonna be very efficient at that. And so what we have to do with our compost piles is make sure to give our little guys plenty of oxygen. So that's why turning a compost pile is a good idea. You can do what I like to call lazy composting, which we do a lot of on our farm, where we just pile stuff. But you don't want to pile anything that's got seeds or any potential pathogens in those piles, because they won't get hot enough to kill that stuff. Anything that I am worried about potentially causing problems in my gardens, I'm going to dump into our big main pile where those thermophilic bacteria are going to be able to nuke all of that. When talking about the different types of composting, this is an open compost pile. This is our main compost for our farm. We have it in a place where it's easily accessible for our tractor. We bring all of our yard waste, our waste from our gardens when we pull old dead plants out. We also incorporate beer grains from a local brewery. We have some friends who have a local brewery. That's what this is right here. And so this is all of the grain that's left over after they brew beer. And we pull this and put this into our compost piles to help keep that material out of the landfill. And so when we look at this open pile like this, it works really, really well because it's in contact with the ground, so those natural soil microorganisms can get into there, no problem. What we'll do after bringing in this material is we'll incorporate this into the main pile. You can see here where we've mixed stuff together. This is a nice mix of beer grains, and it's got a little bit of soil. You can see here's a little bit of clay soil from where we've mixed it in. It's actually really hot falling down here on my feet because it's got that nice bacteria going in there. You might even be able to see some steam. I can't tell if you can see in the video, but there's steam actually rising out of the middle of this pile. We'll actually use our tractor to turn this fairly frequently. And so after it gets a chance to compost for a little while, then we end up with this really beautiful product that looks a lot more like soil. And so you can see this, it's really broken down. There's still a little bit of beer grain in that piece. So we dig down in there and it's nice and brown, it's fairly even. And you can see we've got this nice product here. And so we utilize this to amend all of our beds around the farm. Here's a really nice little compost container that we utilize to put all of our kitchen scraps into. One of the things about composting is that when you're adding kitchen scraps, it often can attract wildlife. And that's why a lot of folks who live in town are not recommended to add too much already cooked food as well as meats and dairy products into their compost container because it can attract animals to your compost container with the smell. We fortunately live out in the country. If an animal gets in, comes around and gets into our compost, it's not that big of a deal. And we've actually had several bears over the years that have helped themselves to our compost container. Luckily, this one is very easy to put back together after it's been disassembled. And so what we do is we just bring our compost from the house out here. Our compost container does have a lid, which helps to keep a lot of moisture out of the compost. Here in western North Carolina, all the rain we have can actually overwater your compost. You don't want it to be too wet. And there's a lot of moisture in those kitchen scraps. And so we'll place that material in here. And then right next to our compost, we have this bag of sawdust that we actually get from a local mill that actually cuts lumber. And so we go get their sawdust, which helps keep that sawdust out of the waste stream. And what this does is the sawdust will add that carbon or brown to balance out that high nitrogen or green material that's coming from the kitchen. And so we'll add several scoops of these sawdust after we add the material from our kitchen in there. It creates that nice layered system which encourages airflow to get in there and also allows that beneficial bacteria to have that correct balance so they get all of the nutrients that they need in order to be able to grow. So a lot of folks ask me when they're composting, should I use a compost recipe? And composting recipes are helpful when you're getting started composting and learning how to do it. And so for any good recipe, you have to know what your ingredients are, right? And so I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the different ingredients that are important for making a beautiful compost pile. The first thing that you need for a compost pile are your carbon-based things. Remember we talked about organic molecules? Well, organic molecules are rich in carbon. And so when we look at this carbon, we're looking at what a lot of people also like to call browns, because these are things that are kind of dry, sometimes brown in color, things like leaves, hay. We also look at kind of stalks, stems and twigs. And these things provide an energy source for all of those microorganisms in your compost pile. They're going to provide the ability for these guys to do their work. And so by providing a lot of good carbon in your compost pile, you're giving these guys basically like the battery, like the juice that they need to be able to break down your compost. The second main ingredient is nitrogen, or what a lot of people like to call greens. When we look at nitrogen, this is a big component of proteins. And we all know, just from growing up and reading about nutrition, that protein is a critical thing in our diets. When we look at living organisms, a huge majority of our cells and our biological processes are driven through the use of proteins. Proteins are like the movers and shakers of our cells. They make up our enzymes. They make up all the machinery of the cell that allows for things to move. And so these proteins are so incredibly important. And so you're gonna get a lot of that from kind of wet green material. And so we think about our kitchen compost scraps, all the stuff that you're putting into your bin in your kitchen. Fresh weeds that have just been pulled and haven't had time to dry out. If you set them somewhere and let them really die and dry out, then they become carbon or browns. But when you just freshly pull them out of your garden, those are going to be considered a green compost component. Also manures that are added to compost are actually considered a green material, even though we don't really think of the color green when we think of manure usually. And when we look at any other things that are still just were recently alive, or maybe even still are kind of alive. We don't think about vegetation and fruits and vegetables as being alive, but they're very much alive, after we pull them out of our gardens. And so that's going to provide all of the protein that those microorganisms need and a lot of the nutrients that they're going to need to be able to do their work. Another important part of your compost pile is going to be moisture or water. Compost will not compost if it is bone dry. That is something that we don't have to worry about in Western North Carolina because Mother Nature waters our compost piles for us. But we do have to worry about things getting a little bit too wet sometimes. And so it is nice to have the ability to cover your compost pile, especially if you're using a compost pile that's putting the most of your kitchen scraps into. Our kitchen scraps go into a small structure that's actually separate from our main compost pile that has a lid on it that allows for those things to break down in a more controlled environment where wildlife and animals can't get in there. And also too, it doesn't allow it to get too wet, so we don't end up with a big soupy, squishy pile that's not allowing for those soil bacteria to do what they want to do. And the other thing that's super important for our compost piles is oxygen. Think about it, oxygen. I talked about it earlier in the video. We don't do very well without oxygen. That's why we breathe, we pull it out of the atmosphere to utilize for our cells to actually harvest energy. And these soil organisms will do the same thing. They utilize that oxygen to unlock the energy out of their food. And so providing plenty of oxygen allows them to really do what they want to do. And it's totally critical for those really, really hot compost piles that create compost really quickly. If you want to make compost fast, you've got to provide oxygen, either through turning that compost pile on a regular basis, or you can actually do a trick that I like to do, which is take a piece of PVC pipe, put a little cap on the end so when you stab it into your compost pile, you don't just basically fill it full of compost. Drill some holes along that PVC pipe, and then when you stick that in, the end of it that's open will allow air to get down inside your compost pile. And so basically you're kind of providing an injection of fresh air into your compost. And that can really help with kind of those lazy compost piles where you don't really want to turn it, or if you don't really have a way to turn a compost pile, you just grab a bunch of those PVC pipes, jam them in that pile, and it allows that oxygen to get down in there and creates that nice hot environment that we want for killing pathogens and seeds. And so when we look at compost recipes, all the official recipes are 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. That is really hard to achieve. Most of us don't have access to that much carbon-based stuff. And so what I like to recommend to folks, and what still works great, is a 3-to-1 ratio. You want to add 3 times as much brown material, leaves, paper is a great source. A lot of folks throw away their paper. They don't realize that we can actually compost all of that paper, we don't need to throw it into the landfill, and it won't break down in the landfill. Newspaper is just fine to use as long as you're not using the slick and glossy pages. We actually can add all kinds of little sticks and material, but do realize that those sticks are going to take a little bit longer to break down, so we want to break them into small pieces if we can. Mulch will work really great. Sawdust works really great. There's lots of different sources that you can find those carbons, or if you want, you can create your own with weeds from your garden by taking weeds and spreading them out in the sun and allow them to dry, and then incorporating them with your fresh weeds that you're adding to help create that nice balance. In the fall, we can get a whole lot of brown material with all the leaves that fall into our yards. Please don't ever take a bag of leaves and set it out on the curb. That is pure gold right there. You want to put that into your compost piles, and you can actually create a little pile to retain your leaves in, and then you can slowly add them over the course of the winter to actually create that nice little layer of carbon in between your kitchen scraps when you add stuff to your compost piles. And so when you do that 3-to-1 ratio, 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, that provides enough energy and enough protein to actually allow for all those soil bacteria to really just get in there and break that stuff down to create that beautiful, rich soil.